So it was requested that I go through some of my own personal preferences that I have for Photoshop, Illustrator, and InDesign. So that's what I'm going to do with this, probably what is going to be a very short video to show you guys how I have my program set up as far as just from the preference panel, not really diving into toolbars or anything like that, so that you guys can see how I work and how I have my preferences set up. So I'm going to start with Photoshop, and Photoshop is probably the piece of software I use uh, the very least. I am using it a little bit more now that I manage multiple Instagram accounts to create um, posts every week. I use it in combination. I have a template, and then I export whatever I create out as a JPEG, and then upload that to Photos, download it on my phone. It's a whole process. But to go over some of the things I know that I have selected, and I'm going to go through all of the elements over here on the left hand side of the preference pane. And to get into the preferences, it's Command K or Control K on a PC, and that's going to should get you into every preference panel in on a Mac or on a Windows machine. Otherwise, it's up in the Photoshop preferences, which is right now grayed out, and this is on a Mac, and you just go to General. On a PC, it's actually under Edit, and it's all the way down at the bottom, like down right where it says Start Dictation on my computer. That's where it should be on a PC. And either way, when you open up the General Preferences, you're going to get this window right here. And that's going to be for, so I showed you in Photoshop, that's going to be for Illustrator and InDesign, how you get to this, the window, the preferences. So with Photoshop, the one that I tend to have always checked is this Use Legacy Free Transform. This allows me to maintain the holding down Shift to scale proportionately. In new versions of Photoshop, you don't have to hold down Shift to scale proportionately. But in every other piece of software, Adobe makes you hold down Shift. So when you learn something for, close to 20 years of doing it one way, and they switch it on you pretty much overnight, it's nice to have the option to switch back to what you're used to doing. So that's what checking Use Legacy Free Transform does. Is it goes back to having it so you have to hold down Shift to scale your images or text or anything proportionately. We go to in the interface. You can choose what color theme that you like to have. I like to have it on the darkest interface. I don't know, to be honest, that I have a lot of things actually set in Photoshop because I use it so little. I do know that I turn off animated zoom. That is a personal preference, and I don't like how it zooms in. By default, it's turned on, so I turn that off. File handling, don't think I have anything set up in that. Performance, so when we get into performance, if you're having performance issues in Photoshop, you can come in and increase the amount of RAM that the program can use. So that's one of the things that you may do. Like right now, I only have it's only capable of using 70% of my 16 gigabytes of RAM. So one of the things that you will definitely want to change is the number of history states. So I think by default it's only set to like 100. I go ahead and set it all the way up to 1,000. That's basically 1,000 undos that you can have. And then for a lot of these more advanced settings, like the graphic processor, it gives you a description down at the bottom as to what it does. But if I'm having performance issues in Photoshop, I'll go to Google and I'll try to find somebody who has had the same experience I'm having before I start changing anything around. As far as unchecking, stuff like use the GPU and stuff like that. scratch disk. Some of you guys might at times have seen a warning come up on your screen that says your scratch disk is full. What that basically means is our programs use our hard drives in order to uses the free space on our hard drive to increase performance. At least that's how it's been explained to me. So as your hard drive fills up, the less room you have on your hard drive, the less room that the program has to use it as the scratch disk. Cursors, you can see here that you have a precise cursor versus a normal cursor. You can change between precise and normal by hitting caps lock as well. So that's a little shortcut without having to change your preferences. These others, units and rulers, I work in inches. My type is in points, so I keep it at that. A lot of these I leave unchanged. There's really no need for me to change them. And I'm just going through here to make sure that there's nothing else. Yeah, so that's all that I have set up in Photoshop. So let's move over. I'm gonna zoom out and let's move on over into Illustrator. So Illustrator I use more often. So I have a little bit more preferences set up here. And I will say that a lot of this I was noticing on somebody else's Illustrator that the properties menu has some preferences, or properties panel, a panel I don't use, has some preferences in it that you can change on the fly, which I think is great. But these are I don't use the properties panel, so I always go into preferences to change out the preferences that I want. So I have my keyboard increment set to a very low amount, 0.0014, and this is how much when I select the object in Illustrator, in what increment does the arrow keys on the keyboard move the object. I like the precision of having very little. It can get frustrating sometimes, but I know the default, for me at least, is way too much. You can always hold down Shift and the arrow keys, and that is going to move your object in increments of 10. So that's a workaround. I always work with precise cursors in Illustrator. So in the Photoshop preferences, you saw that when I checked the precise cursor preference in Photoshop, it changed it from a circular brush to a crosshair. So I like I like those precise cursors when working in Illustrator. I also have select same tint percentage. This means if I have say like an orange color at 50% and I'm drawing a new shape, or I have a new type, and I go to select the color of the previous shape, it will keep it at 50% of the orange instead of just 100%. So if you're experiencing it where you're selecting a certain tint and it's defaulting it back to 100%, then you need to come in here and do select same tint percentage. The other ones I know that I have checked are scale corners and scale strokes and effects. And these are the two I mentioned earlier that you can change in that properties panel. I just noticed this maybe 2 or 3 days ago, but I've always had to go into my preferences and check these. And what this basically means is if you have an object with a stroke, with like a 2-point stroke on it, but the object's a 4-inch by 4-inch square, let's say that, and the 2-point stroke, you have a 2-point stroke on it. When you go to scale it down to 1 inch by 1 inch, it will maintain that 2-point stroke if you don't have this checked. When you have this checked, it actually scales the stroke measurement down with the shape, and I like that. That helps out a lot, especially when you have strokes in working with logos or strokes on type or anything like that. Selection anchor, I don't think I'll mess around with that. Type, can't say that I do. Units, I work again in inches. Your stroke should be in points and type should be in points. Guides and grids, I leave that default. Smart guides, default. Slices, default. Hyphenation, I don't mess with that. You should never really be, at least in my mind, you should never be setting large bodies of type in Illustrator anyhow. You'll occasionally design a poster in Illustrator, but even then, you know, you shouldn't be messing around with type where you need to worry about hyphenation in Illustrator. So, plugins and scratch disks. So this would be my scratch disks are startup. So you're starting to see already how your preferences change from software to software. So it was even the UI was different in Photoshop than it is in Illustrator. User interface, again, I go with the darkest interface color. UI scaling is set to small. I think all that's default. I don't know that the brightness is default. Performance, again, GPU performance is checked. And this is going to differ depending on the machine you have. And I always turn off animated zoom. I really, 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 really don't like animated zoom. And undo counts, I always maximize that to whatever I can. Clipboard, file handling, and clipboard, I think all this is default. Appearance of black, this is really important just to know. It is always going to display, Illustrator and InDesign is always going to display black, 100% black. So if we're working in CMYK, it's 0% cyan, 0% magenta, 0% yellow, and 100% black is going to view as what is called a rich black, but it's going to print as 100% black. So that's what's on the left, on the right. This was a big concern when we first moved over into the InDesign software in about 2003. But we've just kind of trained our minds to know that this rich black is going to print like this. So if you ever have a great example of this is, say you bring a photo into Illustrator and it has some black in the background and it doesn't quite fill the page that you're working on. So you just take a rectangle and you draw it and you drop it in the back. You go to your swatches and you select the black swatch. But when you print it out, the background of the photo is really, really dark. And then that rectangle is kind of this grayish black. The blacks don't match. Well, that's because the black in the photo is a rich black. And I'm going to explain what that is. A rich black is basically another word for it is a built black. And that means it has different levels of cyan, magenta, and yellow in addition to a percentage of black. So it's like when you take all the colors and you mix them together and then you put some black in it, the black is really deep and dark and in, as Illustrator's explaining, is rich in color or lack of color. So that's what a rich black is. So to set up a rich black in Illustrator, you can go in and you can take, percentage. You can do 20, 20, 20, 100. One of the things I encourage folks to do is to take that photo into Photoshop and in Photoshop increase the canvas to what you need it to be in Illustrator, InDesign, or whatever. Sample the color, the background, the black background color of that photo, and then fill the negative space or the space that is needed. Save the photo and then place the photo in Illustrator. Photoshop is going to handle that a little bit better than, say, Illustrator. You can always sample it directly from the photo, and there's it will match better than just the black swatch. But I always encourage folks, if you're working on photos, take it into Photoshop. That's what Photoshop was designed to do originally. Devices, yeah. So if you have a Wacom or a Wacom tablet, it will show that here. So those are preferences in my preferences in Illustrator. Now, if we go over into InDesign, and this is going to be primarily for my my advanced students. but soon it will be for all students because we are quickly moving into the direction of using this piece of software. So there are quite a few preferences in InDesign, and I'm going to try to hit all the ones that that I know that I have set differently, but I may miss one or two. So again, let's go into interface. I do have the dark appearance set. I do have match my pasteboard to the theme color. I think this is checked by default. Down here is in the options, you have when you use the hand tool, what type of how is it going to treat the images and the type on the page, if it's higher quality or better performance. So these feel like they're on the Greek images would be around better performance and not in high quality, but I don't know. I keep it right in the center. So in type, I want to make sure typographer quotes are checked. I think they are by default. I want to uncheck type tool converts frames to text frames. What this does is if you have it, say you have a page where you want your background color to be orange. I'm defaulting to orange a lot, but you want your background color to be orange, and you've drawn a big rectangle to make it the background orange. This prevents you from, what will happen by default is you'll get the type tool and you'll go and you'll click to draw a text box, which is needed in all InDesign documents. And what it does is it converts the background into a text frame. This is one of those preferences I don't understand. Really, my guess is they've seen more and more people use layers, and if you have your background color on a lower layer and that layer's locked, then you may rough in where your text is going to go with rectangles. I don't know, but this prevents that from happening. It forces you to get the type tool and draw a text box, and so in my mind it gives me control over my design more than and it takes away control from InDesign and from the software. Let's see what else I have here. I'm pretty sure that's the only one I uncheck on under type and advanced type. My default composer is going to be changed from paragraph composer to single line composer. And what this does is when I go in and I start to set my type, so I'm doing soft breaks, or I'm cleaning up the rag of my text, and I'm going in and I'm doing soft returns between my lines of text, and I'm moving one word down. Single line composer allows me to do that line by line. If I left it to paragraph composer, it would reshift all the words, and it kind of defeats the purpose of trying to clean up your type. If Adobe's going to, or if InDesign's just going to reshift all the words back up based on your action. So we switch it over to single line, again, it gives you, the designer, more control over your type and your design, and it gives less control to InDesign. Composition, what do I want highlighted? And I usually want substitute fonts always highlighted. And so if you've ever looked at an Illustrator file or an InDesign file and your type is highlighted in pink, it means your font is missing, and you need to go find, or a font has been substituted because your font is missing. So you need to go in and look for that. I don't highlight anything else, and I think that's the only one I have checked. Units and increments. So my origin is always going to be a spread. Horizontal and vertical are going to be inches. So it's going to probably, by default in print, have points and picas as our default, and that's because points and picas are the traditional method of measuring print material. But as we've progressed and kind of moved away from points and picas, we've moved into inches. Or if you're familiar with the metric system, you can move into centimeters and millimeters. And then, of course, if for some reason you're using InDesign to work on any type of mobile app or a website, you'd be using pixels. Again, you'll notice that my cursor key is set to something relatively small. It's not nearly as small as in Illustrator. Stroke is at point, so we want to keep that in stroke. And then I think all of this is just default. I haven't touched this. Grids, this is just coloring and spacing of your grids. There's a baseline grid and a document grid. I don't think as of yet we have talked about baseline grids. If you're interested, I can definitely talk more about that on an individual basis. Grids, this is all default. Dictionary, what dictionary do you want to be using? And as you can see, you have a lot of different dictionaries you can use. So this is basically how do you want InDesign to spell check your document. Spelling, when we check spelling, what do we want it to check for? So by default, I think all of this is checked. So we have misspelled words, repeated words, uncapitalized sentences. I can't remember if I change any of this. I don't think I do. It can get a little frustrating when you're designing something and say you're designing something in all lowercase for it to be like, hey, you haven't capitalized anything. Dynamic spelling is like the spelling you have in Google Docs or in Word, where it puts a red squiggly line underneath a misspelled word. I really like this. It allows me to very quickly recognize if a word is misspelled. And again, you have to think of, well, you should be getting your work proofed anyhow. Any work that you're doing for a client or you're sending to a printer, you should have proof by somebody else, and you shouldn't always rely on spell check or InDesign or anything like that, because it's going to miss mistakes. If you're doing conference materials and you have like a lineup of speakers, you're definitely going to want to print that out and have somebody check that against the text that your client gave you, because you want to make sure that all the speakers' names are spelled correctly. And one of the things I think a lot of designers don't realize is it's as much as you think, okay, you got text from the client and then it's going to be right, but you have to remember that somebody at one point keyed in all that text. So, and it's a human, and humans make mistakes. So you have to go through, and it's your responsibility to make sure that everything's spelled right, from names of people. And if you have questions on whether or not something is spelled correctly, you need to ask the client or point it out to the client. Don't think that it's the client should catch everything. That's a quick way to lose your job. So always have somebody proof it. Always run spell check, and everything like that. Autocorrect, I have autocorrect turned off. There's no reason to have it turned on in InDesign. Let's leave autocorrect for text messages and Google when Google wants to change it. Track changes. So if you've ever used track changes in Word, I'm assuming that this works in the same way. I've never used track changes in InDesign. This is some collaboration tools I would assume that you use more often if you were on a large team of designers, or maybe with your account executive or something like that. Story editor. These are I don't really, be honest, I don't know what this top portion is for, because I've changed this stuff and it doesn't change because I don't use letter Gothic standard anywhere. So, but you do have a cursor option, so you can choose what your cursor looks like. My guess is it's and I'm being very naive here, but my guess is it's different, maybe in different parts of the world. And I think in the U.S. at least, we're very much used to this single type, very thin cursor and having it blink. So I don't know if it's different, and it's different in other parts of the world or other cultures if it works differently. But that would be my assumption on why you'd be given different options. Display performance. So one of the things that is really hard for first-time users of InDesign to understand is that InDesign by default displays your images at a typical or a lower quality display setting. They call it typical, it's just a lower quality. So a lot of questions come in that state, hey, in Photoshop, I know my image is the correct resolution, but when I put it into InDesign, it's all pixelated and blurry. Well, what InDesign does is it displays it at a lower quality to increase performance. So the idea is that, we're going to have either large files with large images in them or multi-page files that have hundreds of images in them. And you're making it very difficult for InDesign to display or to operate if you are asking it to render every single image at high quality. So it will it adjusts it down to a typical setting or a lower quality just so it runs a little bit better. And I know that it is something that is extremely hard to get used to, but you do get used to it over time. And there's some workarounds so that you can check a resolution of your images. And it's just as you get more confident as a designer and as you become more knowledgeable, you gain that confidence, and you also learn the checks and balances to go through to make sure that you are sending printers the correct files and high enough resolution files. Another thing that's very important to realize from a pre-production or a production standpoint is you are a production person as well at your firm. Printers they will just print the file that you send. So your file has to be absolutely perfect. It has to be set up absolutely perfect. All the images have to be high resolution or the correct resolution. Bleeds have to be pulled out. All the colors have to be converted from spot colors to CMYK colors. So there's a lot of production responsibility that now falls on the designer that used to not be the case. Like when I started out, it was not the case. Even though I still was responsible for understanding production. There was somebody that was going to be always at the printer who was going to check that. To keep their cost low, they have eliminated that step in the process, and they will just print the file you send them. So getting back to that explains this typical setting here and how it's set up. I always have my type Greeked below 3 point. The default is 7 point. And what that means is, and you can kind of see it over here. So kind of in my background here, you can see on these two slides, you can see type that's relatively small. But then when the type gets really small, it gets Greeked. So basically what I'm telling the program to do is only when my type becomes visually smaller than 3 point, put it in this gray rectangle or white rectangle. Any other time, show me the type. So show it to me like this. And that's because I like to zoom out and I like to be able to see my type. I like to see what my type is doing. I like to see, where I need to make edits to make it better. It's kind of it's the same thing as rolling away from your screen. If you have the room to roll back in your chair, when you zoom out, that's just another version of rolling back. So I like to be able to see my type at relatively small sizes. GPU performance, you guessed it, I have animated zoom unchecked. Appearance of black, we leave the display black as a rich black. We went over that with Illustrator. File handling, this is kind of, I actually don't know. I was going to try to explain this, but I can't. So InDesign will keep a file open. So if you ever see like a, I think it's IDLK maybe file, something with a K in it. but it is the recovery document. It's like it's the autosave document that it's saving, and it goes away when you actually close your document. But if you're ever there and you're wondering what is this extra file, don't delete it. It's your autosave data. So I don't know how often it does it, but it will save every so often. It's not a catch-all for accidentally not saving your document, but what it does do is it protects you when, say, InDesign crashes or something like that. Usually it will open up the file from the last point, the last autosave point, and then you can resave your file from there. Down here at the bottom of with fonts, auto activate Adobe fonts. That's checked by default, but I think that's something that's very good to have checked. Clipboard handling. I'm sure that this is all default. And then publish online is a new preference area that links it with, my guess is it links it to the Adobe Cloud services and maybe even Behance, but I'm really not positive on what this preference is. So if you have, if you know what it is, please let me know, because I don't. This is something new. So that's the basic run through of the 3 pieces of software that we focus on using and how I have them set up. And I hope you found this helpful. If you have any questions or anything, please feel free to reach out to me. This is going to be a video that's posted unlisted and just made available to you guys, so you guys can see how I work. And I hope to record soon a video of me just working, a time lapse, so you can kind of see what I'm doing and my process. It may have a voiceover, it may not, but we'll see how that goes. So hopefully this helped, and thank you guys again for your time.